All right, and take it away, Greg.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation to do this presentation with Amy. I'm excited to be here to tell you a little bit about white-tailed ptarmigan, and Amy's going to be doing actually. I guess it's kind of the last third of the presentation. I'll be doing probably about 2/3 of this, just covering the ptarmigan stuff. And we were actually trying to figure out the best way. Just got a message that came up. The best way to kind of weave this together, because Amy has kind of her research that is across Colorado, and then I've conducted research for my PhD work that was at just a couple sites along the Front Range at Mount Evans and Trail Ridge. So, and that's a long-term data set that I was working with on that PhD project. So what we've done is we've kind of combined just slides, and I'm just going to go ahead and deliver those. But Amy is right here, so if I give any information from her side of things that's incorrect, she can certainly speak up. Yeah, so this is kind of an outline of what the talk is going to be about. So we're going to kind of cover ptarmigan natural history to start with. So that's just going to be a really brief overview of the Lagopus genus. And then going into some information on history of white-tailed ptarmigan population studies in Colorado, which I think is pretty interesting. This is actually a state where most white-tailed ptarmigan research has been conducted. So giving you some background on that information. And then I'll talk a little bit about population dynamics, long-term trends, and then also we'll go over some of Amy's findings from her statewide work. And then I'm going to pass it over to Amy to do her talk on the brown-capped rosy finches, which I haven't seen yet either, so I'm excited to see that. Okay, so starting off with ptarmigan natural history. So we're really fortunate in North America to have 3 different species of ptarmigan. That's the most of any continent. So we have the willow ptarmigan here on the left. That's obviously going to be the largest ptarmigan species. The rock ptarmigan is the one in the middle. And then in North America, we've got the endemic white-tailed ptarmigan. So it's not only the smallest ptarmigan species, but it's also the smallest grouse species. So the willow and rock ptarmigan have Holarctic circumpolar distributions, and the willow ptarmigan has a distribution that includes the northern latitudes of Europe and Asia, and in North America it also includes northwestern and northern parts of the North American continent. And then the rock ptarmigan has a very similar distribution to willow ptarmigan, but it also includes kind of like more extreme northern latitudes. So if you can find some of the most barren, inhospitable places on the planet, some of the coldest places, that's there's a pretty good chance you're going to find rock ptarmigan in those areas. So a little bit of taxonomy. So ptarmigan are in the landfowl order, so they're galliforms, and they're in the family Phenology, and that's a family that includes chickens, quail, partridges, and of course pheasants. And then within that family Phenology, we also have a subfamily. Those are the Tetrioninae, and that's basically the grouse genus, right? So these are what we also grouse people often refer to these as tetrads. So they include grouse and ptarmigan, and they actually used to be a separate family. They were family Tetrioninae, and that at some point I've kind of lost track of the taxonomy in terms of when some of these changes occurred, but they got made into a basically a subfamily. So some characteristics of the grouse: they have feathered nostrils, feathered legs, often down to the toes. They don't have spurs, but within the Tetrioninae subfamily, we've got this special group, and we're going to be talking about one of those species, obviously the white-tailed ptarmigan. So these are in the Lagopus genus, and this is a genus that has some interesting characteristics that kind of tie it together. Probably the most well-known is the, we just have a highlight that came up there to show you where that's at. So you can kind of see that family tree phylogeny for the ptarmigan. But yeah, so the ptarmigan are kind of united by some characteristics that are interesting. So most of them undergo this very extreme molt that most people know them for. They turn white in the wintertime in their basic plumage. There's one exception to that. It's actually the red grouse, which occurs in the British Isles. That's called a grouse, even though it's in the ptarmigan genus, because it actually doesn't molt into a complete basic white plumage in the wintertime. It kind of stays this, has like a very reddish colored, hence the name plumage that it retains. So ptarmigan have 3 to 4 distinct plumages, and they kind of undergo this continuous molt from their basic plumage to their nuptial plumage during the breeding season. So most of the feather follicles can produce 2 to 3 feathers each year, so that allows them to undergo that continuous molt. And they have full feathering of the toes, and apparently only 3 to 6 distal scales on the toes aren't replaced by feathers. So another kind of interesting feature of ptarmigan is that they have extra large intestines to the volume of the ceca. That's where the microbial fermentation and vegetation occurs. So yeah, ptarmigan undergo a near continuous molt and year round. So they kind of begin molting here in Colorado in early May. So they turn from their white basic plumage to a nuptial plumage. Kind of consists of these dark, like light and brown feathers, and with a little bit of black feathers sprinkled in there as well. And then by midsummer, they begin molting into a more like neutral gray brown plumage. And then by late September to early October, that's whenever they really start to, the molt into the basic plumage really starts to occur. And then by October, they're usually about half brown, half white. And then by November, they're, most of them have completed their molt into that basic white plumage. So ptarmigan, they're always, seeking out opportunities for microhabitats that kind of align with their thermoregulation needs. So during the wintertime, ptarmigan snow roosts at night to conserve energy. So whenever they burrow into the snow, it's going to be warmer than obviously the ambient temperature above it. And then during the summer, they often seek out higher elevations. So especially towards late summer, they tend to move up in elevation as the season progresses. So they'll get up towards like the ridge tops and areas around snowfields, especially for birds that don't have broods or young. They kind of tend to congregate in flocks and get into those areas. So we often, I'm sure everybody here has probably seen ptarmigan since this is a birding group, but during the summertime, like common places to see them in the Alpine would be places like Trail Ridge Road. And, if you see them there, you're probably going to often associate them with boulders. So they'll, especially like midday, they'll be associated with the shade of boulders. Okay, so ptarmigan, let's see. They're a monogamous species. They do have some low rates of extra pair fertilizations. So pair formation begins in the spring, and pairs often reform in subsequent years if those birds survive and if they're able to meet up again. And nesting typically begins in May, early June. They are capable of renesting, so they can do that, but it's only occurs if they lose a nest early in the egg-laying stage. If they get deep in incubation and they lose the nest, there's just not enough time in the season for them to try to get in that second attempt. They'll only raise one brood during the season, so they're not a multi-brood species. So chicks are precocial, typically within 24 hours of hatching. The chicks and the hen wander away from the nest. And males stay on territories during the nesting period, and they tend to stick to that territory pretty late into the summer, but they don't assist with chick rearing. And that is a little bit, let me see. So for willow ptarmigan, that actually is not the case. So in willow ptarmigan, males will actually help raise the broods, and they stick with the females. But in white-tailed ptarmigan, they don't do that. So chicks grow really rapidly because they're very precocial. So typically week 3, right around that mark, they can start to glide short distances, and then by week 5 to 6, they can fly short distances. So in terms of their diet, they are definitely a diet specialist. And the most important vegetation for ptarmigan in Colorado is definitely willow. So during the winter period, spring period, that's going to be like more than 90% of their diet. And this is kind of based off of some studies back in the 60s where they actually collected ptarmigan and examined their crop contents. And it's kind of the primary food factor here in Colorado for them in the wintertime. It's a little bit more variable if you get off into some other areas of the distribution, like in Washington State, their diet's more variable during that time. They're eating mostly forbs and insects during the summertime. And for chicks eat almost nothing but invertebrates during the first few weeks of life. And then they gradually kind of transition over to a plant-based diet that's similar to the adults. So again, kind of moving into forbs for their primary vegetation that they consume. Okay, so there are 5 recognized subspecies of white-tailed ptarmigan. So the southern white-tailed ptarmigan, which is the one that we have here in Colorado, that is the Alpine subspecies. And then we have these 4 other subspecies. So we have rosy-finches, which is in Washington State. And then we have saxatilis, that's on Vancouver Island, Lucura, and then we have Peninsularis. So it's kind of interesting to look at this map here. You can see these subspecies follow these jurisdictional boundaries, which is convenient. But there's been some recent work by a postdoc that was actually working at Colorado State University, Miss Katie Langen, and she did this range-wide assessment of the subspecies status. So she actually, let me go back to the previous slide really quickly to show you. These red dots on this map right here, these represent places where biological samples from ptarmigan were collected. So these were birds that were captured, and then blood samples were taken. And the size of these dots varies by the sample size in those locations. So Katie did this assessment using genomics of white-tailed ptarmigan to see if there was any differentiation across the range. And she found that there actually, there was some. So this little bar right up here, I'll try to explain this. So this is, each one of these vertical lines right here represents an individual sample. And this is basically the results of a clustering algorithm. So this algorithm assigned individuals to clusters based on if they were closely related or not. So for Altipetans, which is the subspecies we have here in Colorado, you can see this kind of breaks up into 2 distinct groups. So this group over here on the left, in this red color, these are birds that were sampled in the San Juans, and then the orange color over here, these are birds that were sampled in the remainder of the range in Colorado. So it looks like there's some differentiation going on there. And then saxatilis, that's the Vancouver Island subspecies. You can see that one seems pretty clear that there is some distinction there in terms of gene flow from the other ones. But then whenever we get into this other group here, the rosy-finches, Lucura, and Peninsularis, it's less clear what's going on there. It seems to be a continuous gradient, more or less. So no real clear distinction in those subspecies. Okay, so this is providing some information on movement. So white-tailed ptarmigan very much have an open population structure. And what I mean by that is that birds move like quite a bit. So this is one of my favorite white-tailed ptarmigan studies, and it was conducted by a guy that did his master's degree at Colorado State University named Rick Hoffman. And in the 70s, whenever he was doing this work, he basically banded birds at Guanella Pass, which is this really big wintering area near Mount Evans. And he, the following breeding season, or the following summer, he actually went out and searched for those birds that he banded. And this plot right here kind of shows, like, you know, where those ended up if we think about a bearing, directional bearing here. So from Guanella Pass, you know, these are all the different locations where he was able to find like resightings of the birds that he banded. And the general pattern was that females tend to move farther away. So they're kind of the key to dispersal on white-tailed ptarmigan, to genetic dispersal. They're the ones that tend to move farther away from the areas, from the wintering areas. And then the males don't move as far. There's even a little bit of differentiation here between the adults and subadults. So we see that the subadults are the young of the year. They tend to disperse farther than the females, which makes sense because the adult females, you know, have higher site fidelity and tend to return. So that was some stuff that was back in the 70s. So Amy Seglund, in her statewide ptarmigan study, she actually used VHF radio telemetry, which has the benefit of, you know, the birds actually have a telemetry gear on them, so you can relocate them. And then there's also the benefit of having a plane. So the general patterns that Amy found were still very similar to what Rick Hoffman found in his study, but because she did have that known location data from the VHF telemetry, the distances that she found these birds, you know, actually moving out to, she was finding them farther away. So for females, the maximum distances moved were in the summertime, it's like 46 kilometers and 53 kilometers. I think that's like right around 30 miles. And then for males, they don't move as much. They tend to be more stationary. So they were moving shorter distances. But Prior to this, the largest documented movement of white-tailed ptarmigan was from Trail Ridge to Crown Point, which is up kind of towards the Cameron Peak area. And that was a roughly a 16-mile movement. So more than double was found with this telemetry gear. Okay, so I think the next slide here is talking a little bit about population dynamics with these birds. So these are some data from our long-term studies at Trail Ridge and Mount Evans. And I actually haven't introduced these study sites yet, but I've got a slide coming up to tell you a little bit more about this. But basically what this does is it shows the growth rate of ptarmigan regressed against population size. So white-tailed ptarmigan show negative density dependence dynamics. So what that means is that growth rates tend to slow down when population abundance increases, and also possibly due to resource limitations. And then this figure right here just kind of expands on this idea a little bit. Advance that. So what we have right here on the y-axis in this figure are the proportion of immigrants, the proportion of local recruits, and by local recruits I mean individuals that were actually born on the or hatched into the study site, and then proportion of resident adults down here on this bottom line. And then this is done for females and males. And these are simply some regressions for these proportions against the total population sizes. So what we see is that whenever we have a population size that's really, really low, our population is mostly made up of immigrants. So, you know, there's some indication there that maybe the population is not able to sustain itself. So we get a lot of external recruitment from the outside coming in. In contrast, if we look at the proportion of resident adults, what we find is that whenever populations are really, really low, you know, most of the birds that are in that area are recruits from the outside coming in. So that kind of open dynamic of white-tailed ptarmigan populations is really, really important for persistence. So gene flow, you know, is obviously really important, but from a demographic rescue standpoint and just keeping birds on the ground, that dispersal mechanism is really key. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of history now on population studies of white-tailed ptarmigan in Colorado. And I guess I'll start off actually by providing some context for where white-tailed ptarmigan population studies have actually occurred. And it's not really in that many places relative to the range. So this is a range map for the white-tailed ptarmigan. And most of the studies for the species have occurred in Colorado and Vancouver Island. So most of the studies that are published, that's where they come from. But we have had a few studies in the Sierra Nevadas as well. And that's a population where birds are actually translocated from Colorado to the Sierra Nevadas. And people have done some behavioral work with white-tailed ptarmigan out there. And then actually the first published scientific study of white-tailed ptarmigan that wasn't like kind of a natural history type of documentation of them was up in Glacier National Park in Montana. And then there's been some more recent work up here in the Yukon. So this gentleman here is Clay Braun. He is a retired avian biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which had a different name than I think it was Colorado Division of Wildlife, back whenever he worked for it. And so this photo here on the left was taken in 1976. And then I actually took this photo of Clay in 2005 on the right on Attu Island on the Western Aleutian Islands of Alaska. This was a translocation project. And he's got a female rock ptarmigan in his hand right there. So we were catching birds on Attu Island, and then we were translocating them to this other island where they historically occurred, but they were basically eradicated by introduced foxes. So Fish and Wildlife Service went out to Agatu Island, removed the foxes, and then Clay was brought on kind of as a consultant to the Fish and Wildlife Service for that project. I was a technician working for a master's student at the time. And that's where I actually met Clay Braun for the first time and was introduced to his kind of work, his study system of white-tailed ptarmigan. So that's Clay just caught a ptarmigan and it's ready to go to Attu. So these locations right here that are marked in the map, these are places where white-tailed ptarmigan research back whenever Clay Braun started his PhD with at Colorado State University were located. So a bunch of different sites kind of spread across Colorado. So Clayton was at these places doing market capture work. And work at most of these sites didn't continue. It was really only 2 sites, Trail Ridge, which is at Rocky Mountain National Park, and Mount Evans, that long-term data continued. So the first year data collection at these sites was in 1966, and data collection has been mostly continuous at both these sites since that time. So we were actually out there this past year or two doing the market capture work. His inspiration for working with white-tailed ptarmigan was basically that he was interested in the question of hunting effects on ptarmigan. So he picked 2 sites specifically to evaluate the effects of hunting on ptarmigan, and those sites were Mount Evans and Trail Ridge. So Trail Ridge was unhunted because it's within the park, and then Mount Evans was a site that was hunted. And incidentally, they both have roads that bisect the study sites, so they're kind of comparable in that regard. But the Mount Evans site was interesting because it had, heavy hunting pressure due to that road being there. It's a photograph taken at Mount Evans at a location where Braun had a wing barrel collection site set up. So it looks like a family that had a successful hunt. So Clay kind of developed some of the field methodologies that we still use today. So surveys are conducted in May and early June, August as well. So in August, we can get information on chicks. We use territorial male calls and binoculars and just kind of like our vision to scan the edges of snowfields to see if we can find birds. And the territorial call that we use sounds like this. This is a call that Amy provided. Thank you, Amy.
Might need to turn it up, Greg.
Not able to hear that? I'm sorry. Well, I was kind of wondering if that was going to work over Zoom, so maybe that's not going to work. But anyway, if you want to know what a male territorial call sounds like, maybe All About Birds is a good place to go. We use a call that's like very similar to that one, actually. So it's a male that calls, and we can typically kind of elicit a response from the male using that. And if the male's paired up with a female, you can kind of see in this photo right here, we've got I think the male is over here on the right, and then the female's over here on the left. We capture the birds using a long telescoping noose pole, which you can see here in the photo. Oops. And then after we capture the birds, we put bands on them. So we use unique sequences of colored bandettes on the birds to, that way we don't have to capture them again. We can identify them based on those marks. And then do some other things. We take some morphometric measurements from them. And then for some study years in our projects, both my project and Amy's project, we also use radio telemetry. So we can get better information using radio telemetry, just stuff that's a little bit more detailed if we want to get information on things like nest success, survival, and movement. That's the way to go. So from Clay's population studies, he found out that basically they're very, very susceptible to overharvest at the Mount Evans population. So it's very much additive, basically meaning that there's not like a compensatory mechanism in place, acting through density dependence to kind of offset the loss of birds. So he also did things like he studied habitat use, and what he found from that were that there are these seasonal elevational shifts that occur. And then he had many other students that followed and did a lot of kind of foundational work on the biology of ptarmigan. Those included students like Terry May, Ray Schmidt, and Rick Hoffman. So this is another researcher. This is Kathy Martin, and she's an emeritus professor now at University of British Columbia. So Kathy basically came on the project to work at Mount Evans. I think she also did some work at Loveland Pass and Guanella Pass. And she joined sort of in a collaboration with Clay. This was in like the 1980s. And Kathy was a little bit more interested in behavioral type stuff, but she also did some demographic modeling as well. So they were the first to make intensive use of radio telemetry. And their major findings were that dispersal is just a really, really important source of population stability in ptarmigan. So most recruitment, for example, of females in the populations tend to be externally. So they're pulling those from surrounding areas. So she also made some demographic comparative studies. So I mentioned before that there was a site where research has been done up in Yukon. So Kathy did some work up there. And she basically found that Yukon birds produce larger clutches, they hatch more eggs, they produce more young. And but so they kind of have this faster life history where they put more into reproduction. But that comes at the trade-off of survival for the breeding age birds. They tend to survive at lower rates. So I didn't have a chance to kind of like produce some summary statistics for this, but there have been a bunch of studies that have come out of the work at Trail Ridge and Mount Evans. I think it's been like over 45 peer-reviewed publications. So compared to the rest of the white-tailed ptarmigan range, it's interesting. There have been far fewer studies that have come out of those other areas. So this is just kind of a question I'll toss out there to people that are watching to maybe just kind of mull this over. And that question is, why have most of the white-tailed ptarmigan studies taken place in Colorado? So I'd be maybe towards the Q&A whenever we get to the end of this, be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I have my own, but just something to think about. Okay, so population dynamics and long-term trends, that's gonna be the next section that I cover here. And then within that, we kind of have these two subcategories. So the first is, what do we know about long-term population trends? And we have information to inform this question at the Mount Evans and Trail Ridge sites because we have data that started at those sites back in the 1960s. But those are just two sites located along the Front Range. So from a geographic extent, it's a bit limiting. So the second question is, what do we know about ptarmigan across the state? And this is where Amy's study has been really informative, and her with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So she's actually studied both occupancy and some more detailed demographic information at 6 sites across the state. So we'll start with this first one. And I'll just say, whenever I first came onto the project as a graduate student, one of the first things that I looked at was basically the breeding phenology of the birds, and because we had long-term data to inform that, and how their timing of breeding was influenced by things like temperature. So that's kind of represented in this growing degree days variable right here, and precipitation. And basically what we found is that whenever we have really warm springs, birds tend to advance in this earlier, like pretty much all birds. So they have definitely a strong tie to that. So whenever it's warmer, you tend to have less snow on the ground, they can nest earlier. And we saw similar patterns there at both Mount Evans and Rocky Mountain with Trail Ridge Rocky Mountain National Park, with the way they respond to temperature. And then if you have a lot of precipitation in the spring, it kind of does the opposite. That is, whenever it falls, precip falls in the Alpine during spring, it's going to be in the form of snow. So what we have then is, snow cover, and that tends to delay the onset of nesting. So we actually did find some trends across that time series of data at these sites. So at Mount Evans, birds were nesting about 12 days, not 12, excuse me, I think it was 10 days actually earlier on average from the 1960s, whenever the observations first began. And then we kind of found similar patterns at Trail Ridge, which I'm not doing a great job of keeping track of what I'm calling things here, but this RM, and it's Rocky Mountain, so it's the Trail Ridge site. And then I should have mentioned too, these lines are just the median initiation date and the first initiation date, or initiation dates of first clutches is what that's showing. So we basically see these advancements, and that's because springs have been getting warmer. So this plot right here shows the population trends at Mount Evans and Trail Ridge. And we have the number of ptarmigan on the y-axis here, and then on the x-axis we have year. And then what we see at the ends here are these red areas. So these are basically the population model, just forecasting for what the population is predicted to do based on what it's done previously, given the demographic estimates from the population. So kind of what we found is that at Trail Ridge, the population generally has been declining since about the mid-1970s. So it's kind of had a very steep decline starting right around the mid-1970s, and it's sort of leveled off since that time. And then at the Mount Evans population, it's actually been growing slightly. And we think we know the reasons for both of these things, and they have to do with like kind of local dynamics at these sites. So at Trail Ridge, we think we have some local habitat degradation occurring there, possibly due to visitor traffic, but also elk herbivory. So basically the willow communities are kind of in rough shape at the Trail Ridge site. And then at Mount Evans, hunting pressure was reduced in the early 1990s. So basically a hunting restriction went into place, and that kept hunters from harvesting birds from within, I think it was a half mile on either side of the road. So that kind of relieved the hunting pressure at Mount Evans. So this next one right here, this just shows the geometric mean growth rates. So we can see that at Trail Ridge, it's been in decline, and then at Mount Evans, it's been actually increasing. Okay, so the next question is, what do we know about ptarmigan across the state? And this is information from Amy Seglund's recent study. And I mentioned all these sites before where Clay did his work in the 1960s. So Amy Seglund actually went back and designed an occupancy survey design where she went to all these different sites across Colorado. I think there were 59 in total, and those included some historic sites. And her and her field crews went to these locations, and they surveyed them for ptarmigan to see if they could find evidence that birds were there. And then this figure right here on the left, this is just showing you where all those locations are, or that were surveyed were. And then on the right here, this is kind of a zoom in on one of these strata. So this is the northern strata right here where the sites were surveyed. So this also shows a couple of interesting things. These two green sites right here were sites where Amy and her crews did not find birds. So this was a really impressive study just because of the amount of work that it took to do this. I've accompanied Amy on some of her occupancy surveys, and I can say it's really, really hard work hiking up to these sites and doing this stuff. So very impressive study. So all the historic sites were occupied. So none of the birds were lost from those areas. And then of the 59 sites that were surveyed, 57 were occupied. And that means that one or more ptarmigan were found at those sites for an occupancy rate of about 96.6%. This study actually spurred some additional work. So occupancy is great. It can tell you a lot about what's going on with white-tailed ptarmigan populations. But a better thing to do is actually to get more detailed demographic information. So Amy did that with her VHF mark recapture study that took place from 2013 to 2017. And the way Amy did this is she chose 6 sites to basically intensively study. So that gives us, again, that great additional information on things like survival, nest success, dispersal, and abundance. So these were the sites that Amy picked, and you can see they're kind of spread across the state. And then these are some of the abundance estimates that came from those. And actually, let me just back up so we can take a quick look at the names here. So we have Byers Peak up here to the north, Independence Pass and Mount Yale, kind of in the collegiates region. And then we have Mesa Seco, Ophir, and Emerald Lake, and these are located down in the San Juans. So they're also represented in red in this figure here. So these are the abundance estimates, and we see something that's kind of similar to what we found at the long-term study sites. Abundance changes quite a bit on an annual basis, so it kind of bounces around. And then these are some estimates of annual female survival. I believe these came from the radiotelemetry birds, or marked birds. And we can see that, again, we do see some variation there. It looks like the sites that are up in the north maybe have a little bit lower annual survival, and things are a bit more stable down in the San Juan range. But yeah, I think Amy found some really high survival rates, especially down in the San Juans. I think these were close to 70–75% annual survival. So for a grouse species, that's like, I think, kind of at the highest end. So these birds that we've been studying really have, they kind of fall on that slow side of that continuum on the life history gradient. So they tend to put more investment into survival versus reproduction. Okay, just really quickly. So Amy completed her surveys of plots recently. So in 2021, this year, she went back and she resurveyed those plots in 2011. And I think we can turn it over to Amy here in a second, and she can probably provide an update on that. And then we're currently in the process of developing a habitat study right now. So we're bringing in a genomic study as well. So we're bringing 2 PhD students on at Colorado State University to do these. And I want to apologize. We've done a lot of stuff with these populations over the years, so I really had to kind of gloss over a lot of details here. And this is sort of just scratching the surface, but that's kind of a rundown of the major things that we've been doing with white-tailed ptarmigan studies in Colorado. So the big conclusions that come out of this work include that the long-term trends at Mount Evans and Trail Ridge indicate diverging patterns that can be explained by local dynamics. The historically occupied sites are still occupied. And then of the sites that were historically, we got estimates for population densities, those are similar still. So there's variation across the state in terms of population demographics. Climate still poses a major unknown. We've done some work with this stuff. I didn't present that today, but our conclusion is kind of what we really need to focus on with the white-tailed ptarmigan is what we can control, factors that we can control in terms of habitat and kind of human management. And then areas outside Colorado may be facing bigger challenges, and we can talk about that as well. Places like New Mexico and Wyoming and even Montana, but things are probably going better in Colorado than other places. Okay, so a lot of people have been a part of this project. These are acknowledgements for the project at Mount Evans and Trail Ridge that I put together here. I want to particularly just call out my graduate advisor, Cameron Aldridge. He's kind of the guy who runs this project now. He's been a very integral part of this project. And I also want to definitely call out Braun for all the work that he did to put this together. And then this is an acknowledgement slide here for Amy. And these are people I know that Philip did a lot of, most of the analysis that you saw from her sites. I think we have maybe 2 real quick quiz questions. I'll just jump to those really quickly that Amy shared. So this first one is just asking, we'll just see if you guys can find all the ptarmigan in this photo. And I've got arrows that I can bring up here, but maybe just take 30 seconds there and take a guess as to how many there are. Okay, there, let's see, how many do we have there? We had a total of 6 ptarmigan. So you can see this is a brood. There's a female right here. And then her chicks are kind of, there's one right there, one right there, one right there, one right there, and one right here. I have another photo challenge right here. This one's going to be a lot harder. I think it's just because of the resolution, but I'll just give you a hint. There are a lot of ptarmigan in this picture. I don't know. Do you want to say anything about this, Amy? I don't know. Do you remember where you took this photo?
This was taken on near Crunky Lake in the collegiate area in Mount Yale. And it's just an example of how much they can just disappear into their environment. And it's just amazing when you walk through a talus slope or a rocky area like this, that they just keep popping out.
Yeah, for sure. Do you remember how many there were off the top of your head?
I think there's 10 or 11 once you throw the arrows up there.
Gotcha. Yeah, so they're a little bit harder to see in this photo just because of the resolution, but yeah, we got birds up here, 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 here. There's one, there's one, there's one.
And even if you look longer, you might find more.
Possibly, yeah, I was wondering that too, if maybe there were even a few more.
It's just the point about how well they camouflage themselves, and a lot of people tell me they never see ptarmigan in the Alpine, and that's probably why.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sorry I ate into so much of your time on that, Amy, but I think if you're ready, we can switch it over to your brown cap rosy finch stuff.
Do we? Let me get out of here. Did we want to ask questions about this stuff first, Clark, or just move on?
We can do either, whatever your preference is. I have some questions, but if we want to wait till the end, maybe since we're a little pushing the time here, we'll just go ahead and wait till the end.
Okay. Okay. Everybody can see that? So I'll kind of just cover this relatively quickly. I was just going to talk to you a little bit about our work on brown cap rosy finches that we've conducted from 2018 to 2020, because I just did not have enough time in the Alpine doing ptarmigan, so I thought I'd spend a few more years up in the high country. And if I get this to advance. Is this not advancing? There we go. So probably since you're all birders, I can quickly go over this. We probably all mostly know that there's 3 species of rosy finch: the gray crowned, the brown capped, and the black rosy finch. And the reason I just wanted to show you this is the gray crown rosy finch range. You can see it's pretty extensive all the way up into Alaska and into the Aleutian Islands. And it can winter all the way down here in Colorado. We see them a lot in the winter. And then even the black rosy finch has a pretty good breeding range in Idaho, Montana, down into Wyoming. And again, it has some expansive winter range, which is the blue. And this is all a little bit different than our brown cap rosy finch, which is pretty much endemic to Colorado. The blue is the wintering area where it can winter. So pretty much only in Colorado, a little bit into Mexico. And most of the breeding range, of course, is in Colorado, a little bit into northern New Mexico, and just up in the snowy range in Wyoming. So we're pretty lucky, again, to have great alpine habitat for this species. The species is sexually dimorphic. The males look different than the females. The female is much drabber with the lighter pink on her belly underside, and the male's this beautiful brown with the bright red. And the interesting thing to me is they have the yellow bills in summer and the black bills in winter. I mean, the yellow bills in winter and the black bills in summer. So like this one has a black bill. And this is actually a summer photo where the snow is just melting, but I'm going to talk here a little bit about their winter survival strategies and some of the reasons that we did not concentrate our work in winter. So these birds kind of live on the edge of survival throughout winter because they pretty much stay at high elevations until storms will push them down to lower elevations. So they need to use some really good covered areas to maintain warmth. They roost as a flock to reduce heat loss, and they just need to eat a lot of calories every day to build up their daily fat reserves so that they can stay warm at night. So they build up their daily fat reserves, and then at night they lose those fat reserves. So in the morning they're very ravenous, and you can see them feeding like a feeding frenzy. And so when the storms hit, the flocks of rosy finches right here, and they will come down to where snow is at least and go into this feeding frenzy to build up those fat reserves. And these flocks are very nomadic, but they do have some high site fidelity. I've been monitoring some sites outside. I live in Montrose, Colorado, and I've been monitoring some sites in Montrose where you can easily predict them that they'll come back time after time when these storm hits, and you can kind of monitor the size of the flocks that are coming to access these seed sources. And so this was a flock that I saw this year. So this area didn't have any snow, which kind of surprised me, but you can see how large a flock can come. And this is over 1,000 brown cap rosy finches that come together to access these seed sources. So this is an example of the winter feeding area. This is a flock in Montrose, Colorado. Oops, sorry. And then this is what that winter feeding site looks like when there's no snow. So the thing for me that is a concern for rosy finches that a lot of people don't think about, because we're always thinking of the Alpine being the issue and, you know, tree line increasing in the Alpine and loss of habitat, and when it's already fragmented, and on and on and on. But for me, we have had drought in Montrose area, and a lot of these ground growing shrubs did not produce flowers and thus no seeds. And so in winter, there is not that food availability for the brown cap rosy finches. So I think it's important to consider not just the breeding area, but the wintering area as far as conservation of this species. And most of you have probably seen the brown cap rosy finches feeding at high elevation feeders. They're very good visitors to the feeders. I do just want to put a shout out to make sure you keep those feeders clean. I have had people send me pictures of rosy finches that have salmonella, so it's really important to clean those feeders. So I just want to remind everybody. I'm sure Audubon Grove knows that, but it can be a problem for them because they get so many birds at the feeders. So the brown cap rosy finch is for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, a species of greatest conservation need. And one of the reasons it is because we have very limited data on this species. As Greg pointed out, the white-tailed ptarmigan, we have a lot of information for Colorado and expands back to the 1960s, whereas the brown cap rosy finch, we really have no information and no information on population trends or distribution in the state. It's another species that we're worried about because of climate change. I mentioned my concern during the wintering season. Another concern is sheep grazing, because we have sheep grazing on those wintering sites that can denude those seed sources, and also in the alpine areas, sheep grazing can be a problem. And then again, recreation is ever increasing in Colorado, more and more people visiting the alpine areas, which could cause some disturbance for this bird. So because we felt like we couldn't really assess the bird on the wintering areas because they're moving so much, trying to find those food sources, they're in these huge flocks, we decided to concentrate our surveys during the breeding season, where they would go set up a territory, have a nest, and we could better assess the population because they're more stable during that time of year. So we wanted to look at, is the brown cap rosy finch population look pretty healthy in Colorado, or is it really small and we need to be concerned because it's a species of conservation need, basically because we know very little about it. And then if we could look at them over several years, are we finding kind of that, a lot of variation in numbers? Are we finding a declining trend, or does it look like it's growing, or is it overall stable? And then we also wanted to look at nest site fidelity. So are they coming back to the same areas to nest year after year? So they have high nest site fidelity. What is the genetic structure of the bird? We looked at that with ptarmigan. We also wanted to look at that for brown cap rosy finches, and just some movement information as well for the bird. So the methods that we used, we did look at distribution using occupancy. We also wanted to look at density. So we wanted to determine bird numbers per kilometer squared. So we did a methodology called using a line transect method using distance sampling so that we could determine that. We were hoping to develop an abundance estimate for the state so that we could do long-term monitoring for the species into the future and see how much those numbers are changing. We wanted to just locate some nests. We really have no information on where. We know they birds nest into cliffs, but we just kind of wanted to look at where we could find some nests and to assess where they were nesting and identify some important habitat components at these breeding areas. So this is some breeding habitat that we surveyed. And when I did my ptarmigan work, I thought I had to hike my tail off to find those ptarmigan nesting. This is me right here, and I'm still hiking up the hill past the ptarmigan trying to get to the rosy finches. So they really do nest the highest of any bird in the alpine. And this is me looking across this slope, knowing that I'm going to have to do a line transect below these cliffs to find the rosy finches. So there is a lot of alpine habitat that is not suitable brown cap rosy finch nesting area. So this is some beautiful, beautiful country, but you can see there's a lack of cliff structure. So really your chances of finding rosy finches up here is much slimmer than where those previous photos were taken, because they really don't use these areas for nesting unless you can find a cliff band near some of this alpine tundra. So what we did is we randomly selected some plots in brown cap rosy finch suitable habitat. So the green is the suitable habitat. And these are 4x4 kilometer plots that were randomly selected to be sampled across the state. We selected 80 to be sampled, but we weren't able to complete that many grids for sampling. But within each of those grids, we would select a basin, and that's basically where the water would collect and drain from an area. And we would set up 2 transects. We had a person walking a high transect. So this green line is an example of a person. This is their actual track when they were from their GPS unit when they were doing the survey. So they would walk a very high line in this basin, and then you would have someone 250 meters below them walking a low line for the basin. And we basically just walked these transects looking for rosy finches. And once we found a rosy finch, we'd stop, We take a distance using a rangefinder to that bird, so that was the incorporation of the distance sampling. I'm not going to get into the whole methods of it. And then we would also look for any nesting birds in the area as well. This is another example of a person walking a high line looking for rosy finches. These observers actually crossed so that they could each do portions of the high line, because the high line's a really tough transect to walk. And basically we're just walking them, looking for rosy finches and counting the number of rosy finches that we encounter on this line. So again, this is me. I'm trying to get to the high line. I'm going to have to walk this whole basin. So this is really tough work, but this is kind of the country that you have to survey when you're looking for these birds. We had to endure some really tough snow conditions in 2019 when we had that really tough high snow year. So this is some of the stuff that we had to walk across. This again is my graduate student, and she's doing the high line underneath the cliffs to document the brown cap rosy finches nesting in that area and breeding in that area. We also, besides counting rosy finches, along the line transects, we were collecting information on the habitat they were using. We were looking at biotic and abiotic factors, from the vegetation to the characterization of the rocky areas that we encountered them, as well as the cliff structure that we were finding the nest areas in. And this will all be incorporated into a resource selection model. I'm just going to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned so far. I don't have a lot of results for you right now, but I'm just going to talk to you about some of the things that we've learned from the surveys. And all I can say is I love my job because this is my lunch hour as I'm finished my last survey. We were lucky because there have been very few nests found of brown cap rosy finches. We did find 8 nests. We found them mostly in 2018. Most of them were in rock crevices. These are 2 brown cap rosy finch nests. They lay anywhere from 3 to 5 eggs. They sit on the nest for about 12 to 14 days, and then about 18 days old, the young will fledge. This is another nest structure, and basically the best way to find a brown cap rosy finch nest is to be able to get up there early enough when they first initiate breeding, and you can watch the female go back and forth. She'll get some mud or some grasses and fly back, put it in and go back, and she's just busily working to do that, and the male just kind of follows her back and forth. He doesn't do any of the nest work, but he does, help feed her when she's on the eggs, and does feed the nestlings and the fledglings with her. So this is just an example. This was the nest that we were able to find because they are accessible for us. We weren't doing any kind of, climbing up the cliff faces or anything. So we were just finding them as we were doing transects. I was really excited about this nest. I actually found a nest in this talus slope. So that was kind of exciting. I hadn't expected to find that, but that was something that was a little bit different. I don't know if we didn't go through and monitor if these nests were successful. So I don't know if this one was successful or if it got predated by some predators, but it was an interesting nest to find. Rosy finches really like to eat insects during the summer months. And you can see over here on the left, this male has a huge mouthful of insects, and this is actually a fledgling that's kind of practicing getting his first ant. They do, everybody's probably familiar, they do like to forage along the edges of snow fields. They can pick up insects. They can look at melt off from recent, old seeds that were on the plants last season that as the snow melts off are kind of soft and fresh for them to forage on. This is just an example of a rosy finch, and they just kind of follow these edges looking for, some seeds and some insects. They'll also forage on the snowfield because there's a lot of seed sources there, and a lot of updrafts of winds will drop a lot of insects on there. So snow seems to be important for this species for foraging, but we were also finding a lot of birds away from snowfields, and they seem to be successful with foraging as well. So you see them eating on some plants and flying after insects. So they seem to be able to forage even away from snowfields as well. And this is one of my driest places where we found some rosy finches, and you can see it's pretty desolate. And I found a high number of rosy finches. This is just pointing out a rosy finch that's foraging on these forbs in this dry kind of shaly area. And they do drink water when they find it, so that was kind of interesting to see. Just showing you some of the predators that we encountered for rosy finches. There's definitely a lot of weasels, long-tailed weasels up in the high country. This is a big predator for ptarmigan as well. I've seen them kind of mess with rosy finches. So I'm not sure, because the rosy finches nest in the cliffs, that they can't really get at the nest, except for maybe that talus one. But they may be able to get some of the young fledglings that aren't able to fly really well. I did see a lot of ravens in the high country. This is a huge group of ravens that were just in the area near some nesting cliffs where I found rosy finches. Prairie falcons is probably the biggest predator of brown cap rosy finches, and I've seen a number of times where the brown cap rosy finches will just start bombarding this prairie falcon. So they're pretty tough. With our surveys, when we started detecting fledglings, we would stop our surveys because then everything gets really busy. The fledglings are very active. They start forming groups, and then you really can't do a good count of the birds. So we only conducted our surveys when we had breeding pairs that were nesting. These are just some photos of some some fledglings and some cliff rocks waiting for their parents to return. I'm just up there trying to look and find the fledglings. There's a bunch down here on the snow that I'm watching. Both males and females care for the young. So this is a male with a fledgling kind of hanging out with him, and he was bringing food back to this fledgling. And here's mama feeding a couple of baby fledglings as well. So the males do help feed the female on the nest and feed the nestlings and fledglings. I'm just going to talk about the preliminary results. I have a graduate student who is doing all the analysis for all 3 years of all the data that we collected, and she's hopefully going to have her thesis done by the end of December, and then we would have more like solid information to share with you. So I'm just giving you some preliminary results. We were able to do 52 surveys of basins in 2018, 40 in 2019, and 31 in 2020. We had 57 sites total that we surveyed across all the years. Occupancy was about 100% in 2018. It was less in 2019 and 2020, with only 35 of 40 basins occupied in 2019 and 26 of 31 in 2020. These are just some of the counts that we had. We definitely see more males than females when we do these counts, but that may be because the females are on the nest, so we're obviously going to get a lower counts of females. But brown cap rosy finches, or all rosy finches that have been studied, they do find a higher proportion of males than females in the population. And it's also, when you're doing these surveys, you can't always tell the sexes, so we had a lot of unknown birds that were detected, and these are the ewes in this in these counts. We also did some genomic work. We collected blood from breeding sites across the state. These triangles are where we were able to capture brown-capped rosy finches and take a blood sample. And what we found, I won't go into detail over these graphics because we're getting limited in time, but we did find that this Wyoming site, we collected some blood up here in Wyoming, and that we did this with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, as well as Erica Zavaleta and Kristen Rugg. Kristen Rugg is from CSU, and we found that the birds up here at the Snowy Range in Wyoming were a little bit genetically different than the other birds, as well as the ones that we were captured in the flat tops, and as well as Pikes Peak. So basically the significance of our findings is that there were settled patterns of population differentiation within the Pikes Peak Snowy Range and Devil's Causeway. Devil's Causeway is in the flat tops, and they were forming some distinct genetic clusters, with Pikes Peak being the most genetically distinct. But the good news for us, and so that might be an indication of maybe the limited ability of the birds to move across these breeding areas with the main breeding sites. But the good news is that the genetic health of the bird looked really good. We had no evidence of inbreeding depression or any significant reduction in genetic diversity. So it means that there is good gene flow going on for these birds, even despite the patchy distribution of breeding habitat within the Alpine. And so I'm going to wrap it up there. My graduate student, Catherine Bernier, will be having some solid results I can share in the future. All my technicians that have helped me collect all the information, some biologists with CPW, and the volunteer Sean Connor, who helped me a lot with collecting information, as well as all the GIS work from Michelle Flinner. And with that, I guess we can move on to questions.
All right, well, thanks so much. That was a very quick tour and a lot of information in there. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. We got one question in the chat from Linda about your transects. How large were your transects, and could they be of any size?
Yeah, the transects, sorry, I tried to go so fast, so because I know we're going over time. The transects varied anywhere from like about 1.5 kilometers, and I think our longest transect was about 7.5 kilometers, and it just depended on that size of that basin and how much it took to get around those basins that we sampled.
Gotcha. So I had a question. So there was some, I guess a couple years ago, we had Luke George talk about some wintering bird projects that he did with brown-capped rosy finches. And there was some uncertainty about whether or not they were still breeding in New Mexico. Are they, I noticed on your map, there weren't any samples from that last genetic thing from New Mexico. Are they now, have they been reconfirmed as breeding in New Mexico, or is that still kind of unknown?
Well, being from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I can only survey in Colorado. So yeah, Luke George was going to go down and sample. I don't think he ever was able to go down there. I mean, we have some records of sightings and stuff of rosy finches during the breeding season. My technicians went down to New Mexico to help do look for some ptarmigan, and then saw some rosy finches, but they didn't really do actual surveys. So
Gotcha.
I don't have a lot of information on that.
Okay. And then I had one other question kind of related to climate change. Is there, obviously they're kind of at the the very upper edges of, the elevation, and there's really not much room to push any higher. Are there any sort of vulnerability assessments that look at different places in Colorado where they might be more vulnerable to at least local extinction than in other places? So, maybe seems like Pikes Peak might be a little bit more vulnerable because it's farther east, where we typically don't get as much snow as we would, for instance, maybe on the Continental Divide.
Well, so one thing with rosy finches is they're very tight. They do have high site fidelity to their nesting cliffs, which isn't something I really brought up, but for the last 3 years, we can go back to the basins that we've surveyed every year after year, and those breeding areas or those breeding sites in the cliffs are pretty much always occupied. So they appear to have high site fidelity. So cliffs are one thing that aren't going to change with climate change. I mean, they're on the landscape. And the other thing with the Alpine is it's so dependent on topography and aspect and all that, kind of where the snow can load. And so it's really hard sometimes to model where those susceptible areas might be. And, they do use snow and they do forage on snow, but that's always hard to say if that's a limiting factor for them, because there's definitely a lot of forage and forbs up there. And, they can catch insects on the wing or whatever. It's more work for them. So I think something I've always said with ptarmigan is we've always been lucky that even if we don't have a huge snowfall, we get these monsoon rains in the summer that keep the vegetation moist. You know, it used to be you go up there and by noon you're having to find cover because the storms are coming. One thing I wonder is the last 3 years, this year was better, but the 3 years prior, we didn't really get those storms. You know, what does that mean for the vegetation and the insect communities? So, you know, there's a lot of things going on, and you know, hopefully with my master's student, well, she's going to be a PhD. This is all going to turn into a PhD. Maybe with her resource selection model, we can have more information on that. But I really, you know, I think we need to think with rosy finches, not just breeding, but the wintering areas, because I think even this year, I think probably there was a lot of sightings of rosy finches in abnormal locations this winter. Then people were like, I've never seen rosy finches here and finding flocks. And that just means they may be having to flying far further to find those seed sources, because those flocks in Montrose came once and they never came back, which they normally did because there was just nothing to eat out there.
That's interesting. Anna Joy, do you have a question?
I had a question for Greg, back to the Ptarmigan genetic study. So since you saw like such a clear delineation between our subspecies and then the others that are a little bit more contiguous, and then you also have that huge geographic separation, is anyone started making noise about splitting them into 2 subspecies and then maybe having like, you know, our group and the San Juans be subspecies of our, I don't know, whatever, Rocky Mountain white-tailed ptarmigan, or like at an absolute level, are they still close enough that that's not really warranted?
So Amy could probably comment on this too. I have not heard anything, and that work was mostly motivated by the petition to list the species as threatened or endangered in 2010. Specifically with respect to that southern white-tailed ptarmigan subspecies, so the Altipetans. So the one that's up in Washington State, the renirensis, that one actually has been petitioned recently as well. And you can kind of tell from that study that there seems to be some continuation in that gradient from Washington up, you know, up to the north into Alaska. So for me, I think the question would be like that's really an interesting place to look in that spot in terms of the designations to see if that one is really, you know, warranted or not. I guess from the standpoint of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you know, the fact is renirensis only occurs in Colorado in that very, very restricted area right there. So they're going to be interested in it for that reason. But yeah, in Colorado, I'm not sure if you've heard anything, Amy, about that. Potential for taking that, I should say, sorry, for either an additional study or for using it to kind of refine the designations of subspecies.
Just to clarify, and one thing just to mention about the renirensis, that was found to be threatened. So with the recent finding, I guess I just want to clarify in the question, are you talking about those 2 fine scale genetic differences within the subspecies of the southern white-tailed ptarmigan? Is that?
Or the fact that the southern clustered so completely differently from all the other subspecies. And then even within that cluster, they were kind of breaking into 2 separate. So because you have this big geographic difference between the southern subspecies and the ones that go up into Canada, plus this really clear genetic clustering, I'm just sort of wondering if there's been any talk of making the southern subspecies their own species.
Oh, their own species. Okay, that's where I was confused. No, they haven't. There's no talk. I don't know that that's been discussed at all. So.
Amy, I noticed in 2020 and 2021, there were 5 basins that were unoccupied in each year. And I was curious if those were the same locations each time, and if you had any idea of why that might have been.
A couple of them. So unfortunately we weren't able to get, like in 2018, we had a huge long build season because there was no snow that year. And so we were able to get up there really early. Whereas like, you know, in 2019, we couldn't even start till July 4th. And then once the fledglings come, we have to quit. And I want to say something interesting about rosy finches is what we found is they start breeding at the same time all the time. Like Greg talked about, ptarmigan will fluctuate when they start to breed. Rosy finches like started in the beginning of June, and you were getting fledglings like August 6th or 7th. So you're really shortened your ability. But there were several basins that had like they were occupied the first year and not the subsequent years. I think some of those were just really low densities, and maybe they're just kind of sink habitats anyway. But yeah, and then some of them were only visited once, so that was the one time that we didn't get birds, and vice versa. Some of them were visited and we didn't get birds, and then the subsequent visit we did get birds. So they may just not be as preferred areas for breeding, because we definitely see basins where there's a lot of breeding rosy finches and some where you just get a couple of pairs. So it might just be those less preferred areas. And so when the population's better, you're getting those occupied, and when it's kind of not doing as well, they aren't occupied.
Hi, this is John Drummond. My video is not working very well, but certainly I hope my verbal can get through. I have a question for Amy. Has any of your recent data been used to address the current 4 species of rosy finches? Are they in fact a single superspecies? There was quite a bit of debate about this 2 or 3 years ago. Do you know if any of your data has contributed to resolving this yet?
No, our data wasn't used for that, and the genetic work has been done by Kristen Rug and her PhD student, and at CSU Boulder. I mean, at CSU, not CSU Boulder. And yeah, none of that work has been put towards understanding that issue. It was basically just looking at what does the genetic diversity look like in the state, and how are these populations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I had another quick question, Greg, that you might have addressed and I missed. But you mentioned the birds, the ptarmigan in the Sierras, and that they were translocated there. Was that because there's evidence that they used to be there, or is it kind of like, you know, moving Chucker to Colorado, where someone just decided they wanted to move some birds around?
Yeah, it was kind of like Chucker to Colorado. There was no evidence they were ever in the Sierra Nevadas, and it's, you know, if you just look at kind of the map of the Alpine, it would be I think a pretty tough dispersal movement for them to have made that. So yeah, they were introduced into a couple of places, including Pikes Peak. Actually, that's an introduced population. So that was translocated. The Unitas of Utah, that's also another place where they were introduced. They tried to do an introduction in Oregon too that failed, but they're obviously a species that you can translocate pretty easily if you can put them in suitable habitat.
Well, as a follow-up to that, I heard there was a recent translocation into New Mexico. Was that just to bolster existing populations because they're not doing so well? Or do you know if they're introducing them like to new areas, or kind of what was going on there?
Yeah, Amy, feel free to unmute here. So they actually were translocated. So, I mean, they occurred historically in New Mexico, around the Wheeler Peak area, and then a translocation occurred in, I think it was the 80s, wasn't it? No, 70s, wasn't it? Amy, I can't remember.
In the 70s, yeah.
It was in the 70s. They did that to the Pecos Wilderness area. They did a translocation, and that one did take hold, and they persisted down there for a while, at least through, I think, probably 2018 or so, right, Amy? They were still finding, I can't remember the last year. Basically, we went down there in 2015, and we were able to capture and mark some birds, and then Amy's cruise came down went down there the following year in 2016, I think it was, Amy, right? And then found an additional bird or so. But after that, I think the population in the Pecos maybe winked out. And so Amy, you can take over here to talk about translocation stuff. But that's kind of the history on New Mexico in terms of what was done there before.
I think I broke up. So did you want me to, I couldn't hear everything you said, Greg.
Oh yeah, I kind of just filled everybody in on the history of the first translocation. And then the uncertainty if there were still birds there over the past few years, if they still existed in the Pecos. And then I was just going to pass it off to you to talk about the more recent translocation, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, they did just recently move about 20 birds to the Pecos wilderness. Basically, birds haven't been found there since about 2017. And it's not really an area that they historically occurred in. Like Greg said, it was the Wheeler Peak area, which is kind of contiguous, you know, through the Sangres down. So we'll see how this one does.
Thank you so much for sharing. It was awesome to hear about the ptarmigan and rosy finches. Very cool.
You're welcome. Yeah, fun to present.
Well, what's your guess, Greg, on why the Colorado populations are so much more researched? I feel like you were teasing us, so we have to hear.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Just offhand?
I would just guess accessibility of the high country, and that people are just kind of, there's more public interest because more people see them, although maybe people don't see them. But just as a whole, there's more road and trail access.
Yeah, I think the two roads at Trail Ridge and Mount Evans were a huge part of that, because you can access the birds in the spring, you know, whenever that pair formation starts up, and you can actually do things like get information on breeding ecology. So that's definitely a big reason, because if you go in other areas like Vancouver Island, they have really gnarly terrain there. It's very, very hard to access those birds. So I think that's a big part of it. I think, you know, I've had a chance to kind of get out and see some of the stuff in Alberta, the habitat in Washington State. I think we just have a lot more habitat in Colorado for ptarmigan. It's just, there's just a lot more vegetation. It's much more extensive. And if you go up into, you know, the Rocky Mountains of Alberta, the bands where, you know, you can find vegetation in that zone where they can actually occur, it's just like super constrained and restricted. So the densities up there just tend to be like very low. So if you want to get sample sizes to actually study stuff, like their densities are already, you know, still fairly low in Colorado, but this would be the place that you can actually do studies like the ones that, the figures that we showed from like Amy's work and my work and Clay's work and everybody else's work. Yeah.
Could I ask either of you to just say a little bit about the purpose of translocation?
Sure. Well, I think translocations can be done for different reasons. Sometimes it might be, you know, in the case of populations that are have like genetic bottlenecks, it might just be to bolster them. So you're just trying to introduce some new genetic diversity into the population. But like, you know, the ones in the Sierras and then Pikes Peak and other places, wildlife agencies like to, you know, they like to move game birds around, and that's true of like most grouse and quail species and stuff like that. It's just very common to see translocations because wildlife managers want to introduce new populations that could be hunted. So I think for ptarmigan, that's been the primary driving reason to do those translocations. And maybe the exception to that was like this New Mexico thing, which I think is partially, you know, to get the populations up down there, not for hunting, but I'd say the other translocations were primarily just because, you know, you want a game species for hunting introduced. I don't know if Amy dropped off. She might have. I mean, she's with a state agency. She might have comments on that too, but I don't see her on here right now.
Thanks.
I still see Amy.
Well, the recent one to New Mexico is not.
I think I know what she's going to say. She's going to say that the one to New Mexico is not for hunting reasons.
Okay, I'm back.
She's
There she
back.
is.
I'm back. Yeah, the one for New Mexico Mexico is not for hunting reasons, so I don't know. That's the only, that was the next thing I heard, so I don't know what else.
All right, do we have any other last questions before I satisfy my final curiosity? Yeah, I was curious, sort of like, Greg, you talked about immigrant white-tailed ptarmigan, and it just seems, you know, when you're standing up at that elevation and looking across to the next ridge, like where do those immigrants come from? I mean, it seems like kind of a long way to go, and you have to cross a lot of unsuitable habitat, definitely in some locations. So are these birds flying pretty far, or is it just basically from one ridge to the next and you don't get a lot of sort of interspersion between the population?
But so I'll just make one comment on that. I have seen them make huge flights across ravines and stuff that are heavily forested to, like, you know, a ridge over. Like they're actually pretty strong flyers. Like if they want to take off, they can move. But I think their dispersal tends to be more of a kind of a skip and a hop from, you know, like closest suitable alpine habitats, and just kind of disperse to that. I don't think they're doing like these, you know, really big quantum leaps in terms of like their flights across that. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely barriers there. Like in Wyoming, in the Snowy Range, that used to be an occupied area. You know, there used to be ptarmigan up there, and it appears that they're not there anymore. And that is kind of a, you know, fairly big distance to go between the closest occupied habitat in Colorado and that location. So they're probably able to do it. I mean, I'm sure occasionally you'll see movements like that, but it's like, are there enough movements like that to actually get a kind of a foothold in the population, you know, to establish a population? Amy, do you have anything to add to that? I couldn't tell if you're trying to unmute.
Yeah, no, I mean, they can make some good movements if there's, so like that female I had that moved 50+ kilometers, as long as there's good alpine habitat to move from. And I've seen areas again that have really good densities of ptarmigan that kind of seem to supplement areas that it's a little less suitable habitat, and they can kind of disperse over there to kind of set up some breeding territories.
Yeah, that's actually the population at Trail Ridge is mostly, if you just take the internal demographics of that population in terms of their survival and reproductive rates, that one's kind of a sink population, so that's not a self-sustaining one. The reason you still find birds there is because you get that movement from birds on the outside coming in through immigration.
Gotcha. Because yeah, there's actually not, you know, I've studied sourcing dynamics in birds a little bit, and there's not a lot of good examples in birds. There's a lot of good examples in other species, but that's kind of interesting to see that there's that dynamic that's that obvious. And it kind of makes more sense because it's more of a, you know, a sort of a rare habitat, just from a landscape perspective, with a lot of sort of unsuitable barrier type habitat in between. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that immigration dynamic, or you could say immigration with an I, immigration with an E dynamic in avian studies, I think it's really critical probably in the majority of systems, but it's just, those tend to be these parameters, you know, in your population models are really hard to estimate. It's hard to get, you know, it's hard to get good information on that stuff where you can actually make inference on it.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the fine scale genetic differences that we're seeing between the San Juans and the rest of the state is that's just too big a jump for those birds to make. Yeah.
Well, excellent. I really appreciate y'all coming to meet with us and presenting everything. And it's super interesting, especially with such a kind of a, I don't know, it's always kind of interesting just to look at the range maps of both of these species and kind of think about geologic history and kind of how that influences the current distribution, and kind of wondering like, well, what did it look like before and how did they even end up here and why are they here? And this kind of makes for a unique story for Colorado. So thanks for coming and sharing your research, and we really appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you back at some time in the near future and go dogs. I forgot to mention that Tyler's wife is also a bulldog. So.
All right. Yeah. I need to send an email after this to both of you then and try to get some more information on these connections to Georgia and University of Georgia.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. So hope to run into you again soon. And we will conclude this. And for everyone else who's still on, we hope to see you on some field trips and in our meeting next month. So have a good night, and don't forget to report out those birds you find, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.